The American Psychological Association, or the APA, they give a really long definition of identity. They say an identity is an individual's sense of self defined by these two things. A set of physical, psychological, interpersonal characteristics that is wholly shared with another person. And B, a range of affiliations and social roles. And then they go on to say that identity involves a sense of continuity, or the feeling that one is the same person today that one was yesterday and last year. Such a sense is derived from one's body's sensations, one's body image, and the feeling that one's memories, goals, values, expectations, and beliefs belong to the self. And that's why they also call identity a personal identity. Now, the first important thing to note about this definition, and the thing that limits it the most, is that it's almost completely focused on the individual self. Sure, there's parts of this definition that talk about how the individual is associated with other people. There's very little in the definition that directly speaks to how the individual is seen, defined, or identified by others. All of these things are ultimately defined by the individual themselves, not their parents, bosses, children, or students, not their society, but themselves. And how someone comes to define themselves as any of these things, this is called identity formation. It's also referred to as identity development in a lot of what we read. Well, the concept of identity formation, it's also shifted and evolved quite a bit since the 1960s. Early psychologists like Erikson attempted to develop a theory for identity formation that could be applied as widely as possible to as many people as possible. And what ends up happening, one way or another, is that the dominant culture, the identities of the majority population, and the most visible in a given society become the model that these theories are based on. In the last few decades, more and more psychologists have wanted to understand the experiences of marginalized groups, because these are often the communities that struggle the most with mental health problems. So it continues to be important to identify and treat problems that are unique to these communities. For example, some of the first studies focus on American youth of color found that Filipino adolescents, particularly young Filipino Americans, exhibited very high rates of depression and suicidal ideation. This was a problem that was clearly unique amongst Filipino American youth. Now, is this a problem simply one that can be attributed to strict parents, or cultural conflicts between immigrants and children of immigrants? Maybe Erikson would say that it was. In his view, an adolescent will experience a crisis of identity when who they want to be, say a musician, conflicts with what their parents demand that they become. But you see, for Filipino Americans, it's often the case that throughout the process of forming their identities, they aren't simply dealing with one set of conflicting ideas. Let me explain. Imagine how a young white person in America comes to the point in their lives when they're seriously choosing what career they want to have when they become an adult. They might aspire to become a singer, a lawyer, a security guard, whatever. For Erikson, their identity crisis happens because they have to choose between that option and what their parent or parents want them to become. The thing is, the idea of becoming a singer or a lawyer may not be strange to anyone else. What I mean by that is that in dominant society, the options for a young white person, especially a young white male, well, they're almost infinite. Their friends, their acquaintances, maybe even their family members might disagree with them. They might even come from an economic background where their dreams, whatever they're aspiring to, it might feel impossible to obtain. But these aspirations, they're never really strange or unordinary to anyone else. This is because these choices and aspirations are reflected all around young white people throughout their environment, in movies, songs, museums, billboards, everywhere. Whatever it is that they might want to become, well, they can find it reflected somewhere in dominant society.
The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences hosts a little show every year called the Oscars. A group of mostly old, mostly white men vote on their favorite movies. The Academy is trying to diversify its membership, to diversify the types of movies it nominates in turn, and hopefully shake this old white men thing. Since then, we've had a white hobbit, a white guy, the city of LA, white guys, white cowboys, a guy from India, white king, black and white guy playing Hispanic guy, and 12 Years a Slave. Yes, these stories of mostly white men have value, but they're not the only stories, as the Academy's choices too often suggest. Just look at this year's nominees: American Sniper, Whiplash, The Grand Budapest Hotel, The Theory of Everything, Selma, The Imitation Game, Birdman, Boyhood.
You see, for most Filipino Americans, however, the identity crisis, it's much more complicated. Who they believe they are may or may not come into conflict with their parent or parents' expectations. But the thing is, Filipino Americans still struggle to feel affirmed that who they want to be aligns with the world around them. This is one of the fundamental struggles of minority communities. It's one of the reasons why they're called minorities. Unlike members of the dominant culture, the people for whom theorists like Erikson modeled their original theories, Filipino Americans rarely see themselves reflected back to them in American society. And so they can't ever be fully confident that who they want to be when they're young is who they will actually want to be as they get older. There just aren't that many models to validate their choices. So you see, it's not simply a question of how Filipino Americans form their identities. It's a question of how they come to form these identities without ever really having a clear sense of what these identities even really are.